So I was just explicating a little bit about our mission of rethinking everything.
I love that.
And taking this moment of opportunity that the pandemic represents to not necessarily speculate about what the future might look like, as the primary goal, but to sort of look at how we might, what might we do today in terms of transdisciplinary practice to think about provoking the systems that we're all involved in one way or another to sort of push them in a direction that might, represent a positive change in some way. So I think in your article you talk about that need for strategies of transformation. And I think that sort of aligns very, very nicely with how we've been thinking about our work.
That's very cool. Thank you so much for the context. You're right. It feels like it's this incredible unfreezing moment, right? Where everything is in disarray. And so rather than just snapping back to how it was, do we want to use that moment to reimagine and then kind of relock into a new model, right? On lots of different things. I love that provocation.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Very cool.
Roger, hello.
Roger.
Are you here with us?
I'm muted, Kim.
You're on mute.
Hold on a second. I'm multitasking, which is what I'm actually on my university campus. Hi there, Carolyn.
Hey, how are you? Great to see you.
But I'm having computer problems like 90% of the planet. Bill Gates, I hate you.
Looks
so
like
yes,
mobility.
And I overheard your initial discussion there. But my input on the idea of provocations is that in a complex system, sometimes you need slow, continuous change. And then the water kind of rises through the system and everything gets healthier. Sometimes you just need to kick the system and have it settle down into a different state. And so, what we've been trying to do now during this pandemic is just trying to figure out how we might kick the system. And, that's a little bit of a negative way of thinking about it because you're then not responsible for what happens after you kick it. That's not my problem. But I think, as you said, we're at a time where we need continuous improvement, but we also need discontinuous improvement. And Terry Irwin at Carnegie Mellon is sort of one of my mentors on this. She has this program on transition design. And companies love disruptive technologies that put all the competition out of business and then you take over a market. But her argument is in transition design, there are some things in the old system you want to keep and some things in the old system you don't want to keep. And so just because it's new and better doesn't mean you don't want some of the old attributes. Anyway, so I'll shut up there. That's my version of provocations. We're trying to kick the system. Yes, we also water it and make it healthy with slow change.
Caroline, you asked a little bit about our agenda or our way of conducting these meetings, and it is pretty free form and open. And in fact, we don't come in with a specific agenda at all. But part of the goal is to really for us to learn from you. I'd be really curious, just as a start point, to begin to talk about your thoughts around the evolution of peer networks, leadership networks, and where that's headed. Obviously, there's been tremendous change there over the last couple decades, but now with this moment of the pandemic swallowing us, what now?
Sure, and we should mix it up because Nina, I know you and I have talked about to me you're the ultimate networker, right, and systems thinker, and how do these things come together? So let's make sure we mix it up. It is interesting. One of the things we noticed I spent a lot of my time with more in the corporate world, right? And with business leaders and CEOs. And, for a group of folks who often spend a lot of their time asserting or showing or trying to show up that they already know everything because they think they need to be authoritative and to kind of have that answer, the pandemic threw everyone a loop, right? And no one had solved for that before. No one had been in that context before. And it was interesting how quickly a lot of, potentially pretty arrogant CEOs, so to speak, like, controversial, right? Quickly realized that they couldn't solve it themselves, right? And even, so at first they kind of went to, well, the CEOs of the last crisis, what did they do? And they all went and talked to the financial crisis, the CEOs then, and they realized that context was totally different and not very relevant either. And I think the current cohort of CEOs realized quickly they were a little bit in it on their own. No one had faced this before. And that if they weren't figuring it out together, or at least reaching out together across the verticals in their industries, across other CEOs, outside of CEOs, that we weren't going to get through this together. And so there seemed to be a pretty interesting shift of, it's okay to admit that you don't know it. And isn't it powerful? What are the possibilities that exist if we actually worked together to come up with solutions that are like a broader solution set than if I was even just trying to solve it only with what I control? And so I think you both got a peer network happening, but also a different set of solutions were options now because people were willing to collaborate and jointly come up with things across their industry systems, across their supply chains, whatever they needed to do. And that's a real shift. And I think there's an open question, at least in my mind, of can we keep some of that benefit? Or are people going to snap back to, okay, now that we're done with that, I'm back here. But like so many issues are systemic issues right now. It feels like we can't solve them with single point leaders. They're going to have to require like networked systemic leadership to solve. I don't know, but I'm curious your experiences, what you guys have seen.
Well, I mean, one consideration that I've been sort of pondering is, this, in a way, it's a misnomer to talk about the pandemic and in terms we've been using as the post-pandemic.
Yeah, I don't know if there's ever a post.
Right, precisely. And so the escalation of crises in the world, from the environment, climate, to literacy, to the discrepancies in poverty. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And there appears to be levels of complexity there that are expanding, not contracting. So is this moment of crisis not really a moment? It's a kind of continuous spectrum of crises to come, and how does that impact this model of more collaborative leadership, engagement in addressing those problems, and at the same time making money?
Yeah. Roger, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I do. So what I wanted to just inject, that this discussion of peer networks, I've been embedded in that discussion for about 50 years. And I think about 30 years ago, this term co-opetition came up, where companies need to compete with each other, but for certain things, they have to cooperate. So if you're trying to convince the government to change a law, then all the companies in a sector have to get together and convince the government. So they have to learn how to collaborate for certain issues, but how to compete and kill each other on other issues. So, okay, that's a negligible sort of contribution to the discussion. The other one, as Nina and Joel and everybody knows, I used to be an astrophysicist and work on NASA projects. And I became a part of a community of practice. There's an organization called the IAF, International Astronautical Federation. And once a year, and it happened this year I think it was in one of the Gulf states, Next year, it will happen later this year in Paris. The IAF meets, and it's the one time where the head of all the space agencies on the planet meet each other. The head of NASA, the JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the Chinese Space Agency, the Russian Space Agency, the EU Space Agency, and so on. And that has just been for 50 years, once a year, the heads of space agencies meet. Mm-hmm. Now, I know it's a little bit different because, this is national competition, not industrial competition as such. But it's remarkable how that chronometer, there's a meeting next year, we'll bring this up with all the other heads of space agencies. Mm-hmm. And it's just not the same as bringing it up with the deputy in the space agency. Can you ask your boss this question? Well, yeah. And one of the ones that I just remember forever is the IAF Congress was held in Beijing, China. And on the stage was the head of 18 space agencies. I think Mexican Space Agency had just been founded. And so there was one. And I forget who the moderator was, but he, in a stroke of genius, he said, can you just tell us in 3 minutes, what your space agency is trying to do? And I tell you, it was devastating. So the head of NASA used the colonial, we've got to explore the new frontier. Okay, the frontier sort of mythology and the colonial thinking that we need to go take over the other planets and do with them what we want to do. Who knows what that planet wants to do? We don't care. We'll infect them with human viruses like we did with the Indians in Mexico. And the head of the Indian Space Agency, he said it in 3 minutes. He said, what we really want to do is to see how space activities can help humans live in balance in the human ecology. Here I am 20 years late quoting the head of the Indian Space Agency, who said, what we're trying to do is to figure out how human species can live in peace with the rest of the ecology. And immediately he said, we're building all these satellites to do telehealth. This was 20 years ago. Poor people in villages in India don't have access to doctors. Maybe if we had a little tent with Wi-Fi in it, they could all get telehealth meetings. Well, now, surprise, surprise, now telehealth is a booming business. Or the other thing is they were launching satellites for remote observations of the Earth. We need data on climate change, and that, some data you can collect on the ground, some data is best collected from orbit. And pretty quickly, he had a list of these things that motivated, it wasn't the new frontier, that motivated. And then, someone in the audience said, well, why do you want to go to the moon? Well, and then it got complicated, right? Because, he was not going to say that for human survival, we have to migrate from the Earth because we're destroying it. But part of that was technology innovation. We've got to figure out, like everybody else, how you send a probe to Mars and how you detect earthquakes on Mars. Well, maybe that will help us understand earthquakes on the Earth. And predict volcanoes before they happen, like they just happened last week, which is the best solution to climate change I can imagine. Let's trigger more volcanoes. So the peer network, in the case of the astronautics community, is how you get the heads of space agencies once a year to fly to the same city and talk to each other and talk to the audience. And it just doesn't happen in so many areas. So I think university presidents meet each other randomly. But
I mean, CEOs kind of have Davos, but that's turned into its whole own.
Davos was a sort of a glitter of hope for a while, because it did bring together decision makers from different communities, and as you say, it became a little bit complicated. Anyway, so this idea that you've infected us with the need for peer networks at times of crises. It's so difficult. So maybe, we're trying to be a network of provocateurs, a peer network of provocateurs, PNP, that's a different acronym. And of course, provocateurs don't organize, so we just provoke. But I think at the same time, that's what Joel has been saying. And one of the wonderful things about what Vanya has done over the last 2 years is, if you look at the list of people that we've had discussions with, it's slightly mind-boggling. And we're consciously now trying to contact people who have nothing to do with us. Because it's so easy, in peer networks to meet with people like you. So I'll shut up there. No, I have one final contribution.
Yeah.
So I made the mistake in a recent article I wrote of referring to the pandemic plus climate change as the Third World War. And I got negative feedback from my son because war metaphors are maybe not good metaphors, but this war isn't going to end in 5 years. And he said, this is actually the second 100-year war. And then I had to go Google the 100-year war. And yeah, the English and French fought each other for 100 years. So there were people who were born at the beginning of the 100-year war and died before the end of the 100-year war. And so war was the new normal.
Yeah.
And that's what climate change is. It's a 100-year war. It will not end in 5 years. And the other thing, and it's a coincidence, synchronicity, at the end of the 100-year war, there was a mini ice age. And it was caused by volcanoes or something. So the climate change war better end with a mini ice age. Oh, oops, we did it too well. It got too cold.
Yeah.
Oops, let's heat it up again. And so my son shifted my thing to, okay, I'm still using the war metaphor that some of my friends have trouble with, but this idea that the pandemic plus climate change is going to end soon. No, we're going to live with this for, pick a number, 100 years. There's no way we can control climate change on a 5-year timescale. So how do we think in that context? And as you say, heads of companies have never, World War II, yes, companies had to have peer networks during World War II, but it was the German companies that were networked with the American companies. And so America didn't join the Second World War until they had to, when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor. And so
there's a lot to unpack there.
what peer networks?
Maybe Carolyn should.
No, Carolyn, what peer network should we try and provoke? Who are our peers in this problem?
Yeah, that is fascinating. So where my brain jumped to, and I'm not sure why it did, so I'll just go with it and we'll see what happens, is like, who are the influential sets of peers that could actually evoke the kind of change you're talking about, right? And obviously there's a bottoms up approach, which is like, how do we create a movement and create like a bottoms up wave of change? If you take a slightly more top down view for a second, I'm struck, Edelman puts out this research every year on like, who are the most trusted voices sort of in the world, right? And there's been a real shift where, and they talk about like religious leaders, political leaders, business leaders, academics, all these different groups. And there's been real shift in those groups. And so it's a bit of a half-formed thought, but if you think for a second that in order to be able to drive change and lead change, you need to have the trust, or I guess the authority, but hopefully the trust of a big cohort of people that you can drive, right? Who are those bodies of people that have extreme influence, right? And is it, like, there is the whole public sector political realm. There is a whole religious realm still in big parts of the world. I think the business realm increasingly has influence, whether we like it or not, right? I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley, right? And this whole, I'm going totally on it. I know we only have 10 minutes, Vanya, sorry. So I'm taking us down the rabbit hole.
No, don't worry.
It's
It's
not that
okay.
as if we're ending the conversation in 10 minutes. It's that Zoom is going
Oh,
to
the
be
Zoom
up,
runs out.
we need to,
Right. Got it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley where you've got all these folks who are sort of, whether intentional on our behalf or not, shaping a lot of future technologies and shaping a lot of future experiences. And they're not really accountable to anyone, right? I'm sort of thinking about the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world and his metaverse, right? And like, if we think about who's going to shape, who are the shapers who are really, whether we voted them in or not, are the ones that are having influence, how do you get ahead of some of those groups, right? Because there's a lot of really powerful people that are going to shape what that future looks like. And that's sort of where my head goes. I know that was a stream of conscience, but just
Hey, Joel, can you let me do 1 minute, jumping onto Carolyn's thing?
Yeah.
So you used a phrase that I think we need to complexify, which is bottom up and top down. Yeah. And maybe the peers we need to connect the middle. And in, one of the ways that provocateurs work is they infiltrate organizations.
Yeah.
So how do you identify the infiltrators in each organization somewhere in the middle, yeah, and connect them? And the idea that it reminded me of, Nina and Joel and I have worked with J.D. Talasek, who's at the National Academy of Science in Washington, and he has been an advocate of this whole movement that we're part of, connecting art, science, and technology, blah, 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 blah. And he identified in people in the National Academy of Brazil, of China, of France. Now, the heads of those academies had no interest.
Oh, interesting. But he found the people buried
inside that were sort of in the mid-level management or something. And by connecting those people, he said, bottom up is one thing, top down is another, but middle to middle yeah, might go both up and down.
That's interesting.
And so I'll stop there. But this idea of a peer network of middle infiltrators or something, yeah, I don't know what we should call them, because we do fall into the trap of top down and bottom up, when in fact the middle may be where the provocateurs can be the most effective.
Interesting. I mean, if you compare, I do a lot of change management work with big companies, and it's funny because that middle, we call it the frozen middle, right? Or the permafrost layer, if I link to my Canadian roots, right? And it's interesting because if you unlock that middle, it can be hugely powerful. When you're doing big change efforts, they're the hardest. Like often the narrative is more, it's that middle layer that blocks the change, right? Like it blocks it coming up, it blocks it coming down. They're really hard to mobilize. But if you could mobilize it, it could be hugely effective, right? But a lot of the narrative around that middle right now is that they're blockers, not change champions. But maybe that's false narrative.
I think that in addition to consider the players, whether they are at the bottom or top or the middle, it would be also very important to consider the situation, the overall environment, and I don't mean here the natural environment, I mean the political, the social, whatever environment, and how that has changed over the last, 20 years, really dramatically. How just even the overall, the population, how fast information is spread now across the board. I don't even want to go back historically, how slow it was, but just in the last couple of decades, how in a few minutes, that ash has covered Tonga, which is very far away from here. Maybe you can do something immediately, maybe not. But whatever we do, we always have to also, I think, consider the whole our environment in terms of all these provocations.
But okay, Nina, if I can contradict you,
Please.
and you and I are best enemies. We've fought each other for 25 years or longer.
Longer.
So somehow the way you're talking, I think we need to change frames of reference somehow. As you know, I have a pet hate for dead French philosophers. And I think it was Paul Virilio who was very worried about the internet because he just pointed out the simple fact that bad news travels quicker than good news. Of course, he didn't anticipate that fake news would travel even quicker than bad news. And he made it just such an accurate observation that the more the world gets interconnected, the danger is the bad news will dominate the good news. And so Tonga is a great example, Nina. That's bad news. A lot of people, their lives have been ruined and we don't know exactly whether it's going to go off again and so on. And so how do we anticipate in these wonderful new technological systems, how they accelerate the spread of bad news and fake news?
It's not a contradiction. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to provoke you.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it raises the question of if you're trying to provoke people to change, which is more effective, to sort of do the bad news, you have to do it or else, or the good news kind of light on the hill, what could be possible? It's probably a mix of both, right? But how do we, like, if you're provoking folks, what's the balance of what you want to trigger?
But I guess my point is that as a former engineer, you almost never can figure out the negative consequences of your technology. I mean, the obvious ones yet, but I don't think the founders of Instagram could have put themselves in the shoes of 14-year-old teenagers who were becoming anorexic because they weren't beautiful enough.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way. And even I could sit down and say, we're going to deploy Instagram. What are the possible negative effects?
Right.
And yes, some of them, we know piracy, phishing, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But the fact that it could have such a negative health effect on millions of people, I don't think I
agree. You never could anticipate all that. I do think the fact that it was a bunch of white and Indian 25-year-old men creating it was just a really narrow set of views, right? And so is there something about this peer network that the diversity of experience, the diversity of context brings important views so that we can look around corners and anticipate things maybe a bit better? Not
okay,
just
so we
gender and
should
ethnicity,
so
but
we
all
should
of
hire
that.
more let's hire more 14-year-olds, except that's called slave labor.
No. But is there a way of getting multiple voices? Yeah, sorry, Joel.
No, I think something very similar is taking place right as we speak, which is this evolution of the new transaction space of the blockchain and NFTs, and I mean all that whole landscape that is represented by this new environment that's really super attractive to a generation of thought leaders and innovators who are jumping in on this and creating it, giving it life. And like at my university, when students were coming into the MFA program in the arts and in the media technology, the ones who the most interesting applicants are the ones who are saying, I want to go into that universe and create that world. That's the space I want to operate in. And a large majority of them are young, white, Indian, Asian, creative types who are lost the link. Sorry. No, I was just sort of pointing that we're in another moment of this very speculative narrative that's unfolding about what the future is going to look like, that's being defined by a new generation of creatives, that I think that it would be a smart thing to sort of step back a little bit and take a hard look at and infuse that with provocations from different perspectives and different cultural contexts that might shape it in a different path.
I believe Roger has something to say.
I just don't want to do the usual thing here of dominating. So I just want to refer to an experience that happened to me in Mexico City. As Nina will remember, there was an annual conference on the arts and space in Mexico City called Cosmica.
Yes.
And it was a wonderful annual thing. And what was the name of the young Mexican guy?
I don't remember.
I can't remember who organized that. Anyway, so, but one year, I was talking to some of the students there. The university is UNAM, I think, I forget the acronym. And somehow the topic came up that I was interested in smoking some marijuana. I know this is in the recording, but they said, oh, no problem. You just go to this edge of campus at 10 p.m. tonight, because that's where the drug smugglers go to sell drugs to the students every night. And then we got into a discussion of illegal immigration in America and the drug trade. Well, it turns out trade routes, aka the internet, what went on the Silk Road? The drug trade and the sex trade. I'm sorry. This is an observational fact that just as Virilio said that the bad news spreads quicker than the good news, and he didn't think the fake news would spread even quicker, that trade route, we should have anticipated that the internet, the two biggest businesses are the sex trade and the drug trade. And that gets into Joel's comment about NFTs. So yes, NFTs are a good thing for some things. Artists can sell their artwork if they're poor in Argentina, but NFTs and blockchain is being used for sex trade, drug trade, hacking, I mean, you name it. So, maybe we're just dealing with problems that are global in scale, and we've never had to treat global problems like climate change. Yes, we've had epidemics for the last 100,000 years, but they tended to be regional. The avian flu, so it was the birds spreading it on their migration routes, or mad cow disease. It was mostly in England.
Yeah.
But a global pandemic and global climate change is, I think, a little bit unprecedented in the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, and we maybe don't have the forums and the mechanisms to work through it.
So who are the peers who should be talking to each other?
Yeah. Because you're right. I think we're struggling that the current global forums we have are not, the UN doesn't have a lot of efficacy, right? There's all these different current structures. And so is there a new set of structures, or is there an informal network? What's the new?
Okay, so Nina, Joel, Vanya, so we've had a number of discussions that kind of get into these areas. As some of you know, my father was a communist in the 1930s. Nina hates communists because she had to flee over the.
But don't say just hate. That's that's just
not enough.
Please.
No, but then any smart graduate student in the 1930s was a communist in California. The Communist Party was legal. They had candidates for mayor that didn't get elected because capitalism had failed at that time with the Great Depression. And so, any 22-year-old would say, well, capitalism has failed, let's try communism. But after World War II, my father became anti-communist, because then he saw how the Soviet Union had applied the wonderful theory of communism and it was as bad as capitalism. So he became anti-communist. And then he and my mother, were part of the founding team of UNESCO, and the United Nations was the solution. Well, sorry, Mom and Dad, that didn't work either. So, and you know, Nina and I have a lot of discussions about, we talk about international, maybe that's the wrong vocabulary. It's really interregional, I think we used for a while, Nina. You know, we tried to.
I don't think that we have a really a correct term which covers what we are talking about.
So at the time, you know,
Joel,
it was.
what did you, Joel?
I was just going to say that a third factor in it, besides the kind of language that's being used, is the decentralization of peer networks. So that they're less about the sort of traditional peer-to-peer, regardless of what level they're at, bottom, middle, or top. That if you're only talking to those who are similar to you, that's not that effective, I don't think. And so I think part of the promise of this pandemic transition moment is this sort of decentralization of being able to listen to others, and a different kind of practice of learning that I think in general, at least Western culture, is not very adapted to or accustomed to doing, because we're so dedicated to our hierarchical, command control structures, even if we bastardize them and manipulate them in different ways to make them seem more egalitarian. In the end, they still are about command and control. And so it's interesting to think about how CEOs or leaders in any field at any level can begin to decentralize their behaviors in a way that that listening is advanced, and and therefore a different kind of learning.
I think that those ideas of listening and learning, that's such a powerful thought, right? Is that one of, if we think about the from to shifts, right, of how we used to solve problems and how we need to, think about it, I think that shift towards radical listening, right? And what does that mean and what does that look like? I think that's a fascinating piece. So we're, as you say, we're not good at. Right?
Do you have thoughts about what radical listening involves?
I mean, other than I'm with you that I think some of our current structures aren't super good at it, right? So companies are playing around with it. There's lots of talk of agile organizations and bottoms up thinking, and how do you get input from people and all of those things. I think it's pretty early and pretty nascent, right? In terms of figuring out how that works. And then not just listening, but how does that then inform decision making?
Yeah.
Right. So is it one thing just to listen and then the senior people still go away in a room and decide? Or do you actually devolve some of the decision making power and the power to act further down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Vanya, you're being very quiet. Could you jump into how we might connect this peer-to-peer network discussion in your context?
It's just that I've been growing so many concepts right now. I'm so confused. Yeah, peer networks are really new to me. So I don't think I would have a recommendation or a thought on how to change it yet.
Okay, that's great. So let me
while you're thinking, Roger,
yep.
I was in line at Trader Joe's yesterday.
Yeah.
And here in Silicon Valley, going through my local Trader Joe's.
I said, where do you live? You gotta tell me.
I live in Willow Glen in San Jose.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. We're just
Yeah.
in Burlingame, so not far.
Okay. Yeah. So I was standing in line, and the cashier on the other side of me was speaking to this young man. His probably early 30s, I'm guessing. And he is going on in this very elaborate description of his workplace. And you couldn't help but overhear how he was talking about it, and the enthusiasm and love, and what he was advocating was, this is such a great place to be because I don't have to be anywhere else ever. I'm with my peer network. I'm with the people I like to hang out with. There's no difference between my personal life and my private life. It's all bundled into this package of the corporate experience, right? And he's saying all this because he's hitting on the cashier, the young woman, trying to get her like, hey, this is who I am. Let me give you my information so you can contact me, and I can put you in contact with this. I can bring you into this network. And I just found that so fascinating that when we talk about reaching into that middle management world, what are we really talking about here? It's sort of like, I don't know. I it just amazed me. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, Roger, go ahead.
Unless Vanya does, I just two things let me just put down. So as I was listening to the discussion, I thought of the work of Helga Novotny, who was, for a while, she was the president of the European Research Council, giving out EU funding grants to scientists. And at some point she said, this is a bunch of scientists, peers, awarding money to their peers. She says, this is deeply problematical. Science needs to become socially robust. And then the discussion was, oh yeah, we'll have a citizen on the committee listening to the discussion and commenting. She says, no, that's not what socially robust means. And then she got into these discussions that after World War II, since so much science was military, scientific research labs were built behind barbed wire fences. And so, science has been in a culture where you don't let everyday people into the lab. You have to get permission to go into a scientific lab, unless like the supermarket or whatever you were at, Joel, you don't need permission to go buy something at the supermarket. But her phrase, socially robust, then gets into, okay, scientists, why don't you, when this became part of the citizen science movement and all that, maybe you should experience the products that your company is selling and see what it does to you. And, a lot of people sell products without experiencing them. And so her argument about social robustness was put yourself in the shoes who are either the victims or beneficiary of scientific research. And being in the shoes doesn't mean you just invite one of them to be on the city council. We'll have an everyday citizen on the citizen council, and then the people will have the understanding of the people. And it's difficult. It's difficult. I have another thing, but I'll stop on that one.
They're building, or they will be building the new Google campus here in San Jose. That is going to be this massive infrastructure build out near the.
And there'll probably be a guard at the gate.
Well, no. In fact, it's sort of taking the approach of making that environment into a kind of open door social.
Kind of a benefit for the community.
And so it will have housing, it will have low income housing, it will have parks and spaces that the public can move through.
I think San Jose City pushed pretty hard to make that true, right?
Yeah, very difficult to make it true, because I think the kind of thing that Roger, that you were alluding to was, I mean, we're both out of the MIT environment, and I remember quite distinctly one of my favorite things about MIT was wandering the hallways, and you'd see a laboratory and something weird thing going on in there, and you just walk in and sort of, hey, I'm Joel. What are you guys about? You know, and what are you doing? And that kind of fluidity is different than the kind of fluidity that the Google campus represents. Of course, it's sort of creating a facade of social engagement with the community. Not that, I mean, I'd rather have that than nothing, of course. But you know, what does it mean to be able to, you know, deal in that transfer space between the decision makers and those who are impacted by their decisions? That distance between those two worlds is so vast. And you think about all the folks who are sitting around, you know, having watched all these CEOs launch themselves into space over the past year, you know.
Meanwhile, they're working in the distribution center at Amazon.
Exactly.
I mean, there's an interesting thread in all this, which is like, as you think about your mandate and provoking change and all of that, who is it whose voices matter and whose voices should be shaping that reimagining, right? There's something to that, right? And how do we listen broadly?
Yeah.
I believe that from some time to now, there's been a like a snowball of enterprises or businesses trying to be socially responsible. And I don't think they're actually being responsible or trying to get into knowing their communities, but just like creating a facade that they are trying to be environmentally responsible, I don't know, fight racism within the business.
That was called greenwashing for a while, Vanya. You know, you greenwash your company. Oh yeah, we're trying to be concerned.
Yeah, so when Joel talks about this new Google campus, it almost feels as if they're creating this new, I don't know, I'm from 2010 internet, so I used to see a lot of images of, wow, my dad works at Google and they have this ball pit and you can go into the ball pit and work from there, and you thought like, I want to work on Google. And I mean, yes, that stimulates girls on getting into STEMs, but also I've seen a lot of people that not talk trash, but don't talk good about Google. And it's kind of this, they create this facade of, oh, we're so nice, we're so good, it's fun to work with us. And then you go in and they exploit you. And I feel as if this Google campus is going to develop into something like it.
Interesting. Super. I need to jump, but this is
okay. Just to finish, Carolyn. So you've now infected me with the concept of radical listening, and I think we need to work on it as well as the peer networks. So the link I gave is an example of radical listening, I think. So my friend Bonnie Pittman, who is the director of the Berkeley Art Museum, the Seattle Museum, Dallas Art Museum, developed this practice where, you know, and just do something new all the time. Use a different part of your brain. And part of it is, when, as you say, Joel, when you're in the line in a supermarket, start talking to the people in the line. And suddenly you'll find out they're right-wing Republicans with guns. Well, talk to them in line for 16 seconds and you might understand their context better. And it's true, you are the company you keep. So if all you do is talk to your peers,
right,
then
which is what technology funnels us to, right?
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's the point. Yeah.
So, you know, who are the peers that we're talking about? And if you're just keeping if the company you keep is people like you, well, drug addicts, if you spend time with drug addicts, you become a drug addict. You know, what surprise, surprise. You know, why do you need a PhD to know that? So I think the radical listening also and I guess I'm going to have to think about your provocation of radical listening, because we're part of the community that loved Pauline Oliveros, who died during the pandemic. She developed the technique of deep listening. But I don't think she talked about radical listening, did she, Joel or Nina, that you knew her?
No.
No.
I think radical listening, I'm just going to say this and then I know, Carolyn, you got to go, but
Yeah, Carolyn
radical listening has something to do with not listening.
Seymour.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you
so much. This is wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much.
Talk again.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Bye.